Good evening. Good to see you tonight. Keaton, thank you for that introduction. It was not true. That is factually incorrect, but hilarious. Thank you anyway. Please don't ask me about anthropology. I barely know what that means. But I'm glad you've been here this whole summer, and I'm glad you're here tonight. I hope you have your Bibles, and I hope you're ready to discuss from God's Word and use our brains a little bit tonight, hopefully. Maybe your brain is tired out from the day. I don't know how yours works, but we're going to try and use our brains a little bit tonight to discuss this topic. Can we know God exists? And I'm really excited for tonight, too, because it's not often that I get to be a part of the adult class in here. This feels so prestigious in the big auditorium. So I'm glad to be here tonight. I encourage and welcome your questions and your comments. It's going to be a good night of study today. This whole summer series has been based around kind of a couple different sections, and some of the questions focus around the idea of apologetics, and some focus around the idea of the church and how and the really some of the major questions in each of those sections of thought and of thinking and religion and theology. And so when Keaton was asking what I would like to do, I did tell him, I would love to handle some of the apologetics, because this is something that's always been very interesting to me. Apologetics, specifically in proving the existence of God and really just digging into what can we know, right? I love how this is phrased, how Keaton phrased it. Can we know that God exists? Can we know these things? There's really a lot of these questions and topics we're discussing are difficult things that you could talk to somebody and really wrestle back and forth about how to interpret things or what they think. You might have a really rock solid argument in your head for why God exists, and somebody's just like, that doesn't make any sense to me. And so we all come at this from very different angles, but tonight I just want to get into some of the basic arguments that are some of the most common as well. I say basic, but I more mean common arguments for the existence of God. And we're going to talk about 4 of those tonight and how important they are for us to understand for our own benefit, also for creating a defense when those ask us for the reason for the hope that is in us, right? We've got people from the world that are always like, whoa, why do you believe all that? Your life is pretty restricted. You've got a lot of things you got to make sure you do, and why do you do that? And that's what Peter tells us. We have to be ready to give an answer to those things. And one of those, the most basic question probably of all of that is, if everything that we believe about this book determines the direction of our lives, and we believe it to be authoritative, and we believe it to mean something, and we believe that it's worth following and spending hours and hours of our every week on personally and gathering together, there has to be something or someone behind it. Right? I don't know too many book clubs that gather around the Chronicles of Narnia as often as we do about this book. Now, maybe there are some out there, but this is not a book club. This is not just a group of people that just want to discuss only intellectually or only emotionally. This God and what He's given us in our minds and hearts touches every facet of our being, because He created our being. That's what we believe. So if we're trying to explain those things, this basic question is, how do we know that God exists? So we want to look at 4 of those ways tonight. And after each of them, I kind of want to get your feedback. How do these each resonate with you? Are they challenging? Is it hard to comprehend? Does this help you, or does this make it harder for you to understand maybe? But we'll get into each of those in a minute. Can somebody read for me Romans chapter 1 and verse 20? Romans 1, start with 19 and then 20.
For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse.
Our question tonight is, can we know that God exists? Can we know something about God? And the basic premise of who God is that He is. right? That he exists. And what Paul says here at the beginning of Romans, as he starts to, before he can ever get into all of his theology about grace and mercy and salvation and righteousness and justice and sovereignty of God, before he can touch any of those topics, he has to have a fundamental understanding, and we have to be on the same page here about this God. And what he says here that Justin read for us is important. Where do we go to learn about this God, to know who this God is? And what he says in Romans 1:19 and 20 is, what about God that we can know is plain because God has revealed it? But he's revealed it in what he has made. God has given us tools built into the creation. And I wouldn't even say it's a separate thing. It's not, I don't think it's that God said, hey, I really want to make sure they know I exist. So let me make sure I do this really cool thing and to make this really beautiful and make them and point them to me. We have to understand God, who he is, just emanates beauty and creativity and his intelligence. And so we can't help but when we look at the things he has made, we cannot help but know that he is and that they came from him. Because these things that we see, again, as Paul says in Romans, his invisible attributes, right? We're dealing with understanding and knowing who a God is or that there is a God that is invisible. Right? A lot of us, to kind of use the analogy sometimes, this might be a little bit basic, but it helps. Okay, we can't see gravity, but we know there's gravity, right? We know the effect of gravity, and we live in the effect of gravity, even though we can't see it. God is invisible, and those things can be seen in what he has made. So there's some things that we're going to look at tonight that really help us dig into and understand and make sense of what we can see that God has made. And those are called empirical proofs. Those are things that are empirically seen, which means just through experience. You can look into the world and you can taste, touch, smell, feel, all of these, hear, all of these things that help us get an idea and an understanding for this God who, though he is invisible, we know something about him because of what he has made. Then on the other side, there's going to be a couple proofs and a couple ways that we dig into understanding who God is that are strictly based on rational thought. And so there's some ways that we can, like I said, exercise our brains and use our brains tonight and as we dig into these anytime, that are less about what we can taste, touch, feel, hear, and see, and they're more about how we can use our brains that he has given us to just truly understand that he's there. And that's a really cool way that God has helped us to understand his existence and that he is there. And so each of those are different, right? We have some that are based on the evidence, and you look at the facts, and you look at the things that you can see and know. And then there's other things that are based more in your mind and trying to understand and think through how can we know God exists. And I'll say this, in my experience, when I was growing up, I was a big fan of Apologetics Press, and I still am. But I mean, like, I was telling Hayden, he was here at the church building today, working with us, and I was telling him about how I went to a debate that Kyle Butt, if you've read any of his books, you know who that is. He works for Apologetics Press. He does a really good job defending the existence of God and these things. And he had a debate, actually, when we lived in Seneca, South Carolina. It was at Columbia, in Columbia at University of South Carolina. And so me and my family went because it was relatively close to us, and we were like, this is great. And I had Kyle Butt's books on the dinosaurs and how we can know based on the age of the earth that the earth is not millions and billions of years, it's thousands of years old. And all of these proofs and empirical things through, again, dinosaur fossil record, these cool things, the design of the bombardier beetle, and cool things that you can see that he's written about. And I was like, this is awesome. This is great. And so after his debate with this pretty prestigious atheist, my parents were like, I know you love his books. You know something else? We know that guy. My parents went to school with Kyle Butt at Freed Hardeman, and I was like 8 years old, and I was like, he was like a celebrity. I was like, they said, my mom was like, you want to go meet him? And I was like, no way. So I left that day with a signed copy of The Dinosaur Delusion, and I thought that was pretty funny. But that was what shaped me in my nerdiness as a kid. Like, there were things that I just loved to learn about apologetics. And again, what's cooler than dinosaurs at 8, 10 years old? That was a way that was kind of impressed on me as a younger kid. But I will say now, as I get deeper into my study and into my faith, sometimes the rational arguments of who God is and understanding him in our own minds sometimes have a bigger weight on my brain than even just looking at dinosaur fossil record or of the design of the universe. And so it might be that at different points of our lives, there are certain arguments that appeal to us more. But that's also going to be the case when you're talking to different people, and we have to remember that too. Right? It's pretty easy for us to find the one proof that just really feels like it proves God exists, and it's a catch-all and it applies to everybody, but that's probably not the case. We all come at apologetics, we all come at our study, we all bring our brains into a conversation, and we've all been shaped by something. We call that worldview. So all of our worldviews are based on where we've grown up, or the family that we have, or the sports team we're a fan of, or where we went to college, or if we went to college, or what job we've worked. Everything about our entire lives has shaped our worldview, and it makes our brains work differently. And so there's different ways that we can interact with and understand God and his presence and his existence that we need to recognize that it's not a one-size-fits-all. And that's why I wanted to share several of these major arguments with you this evening so that you can find what is most helpful to you and that we can all grow in our understanding not only of who God is, but that he exists and how we can be confident in that. To answer the question tonight, can we know that God exists? I believe the answer, spoiler alert, is yes. I do believe we can know that God exists because it's what Romans 1:19 and 20 says. Right? His invisible attributes are clearly perceived. So Paul says. Faith also adds the element of understanding that there are things that we will not know, and those things are left to without sight, right? That's when we walk not by sight, but by faith. But there are ways that God has clearly made himself known to us so that we have no excuse, as it says in the end of verse 20 there. So I want to get into a couple of these today. And I put them on the board for you just so if you're taking notes or if you want to write these down so you know how they're spelled or you can dig into them later. The first argument for the existence of God, this is one of those thought arguments, one of those reasonings that comes mainly from the mind and not so much from experience. This is called the ontological argument. And this is what we call, in philosophy, an a priori argument. That's two words in like Latin or something. A priori basically just means that it doesn't rely on physical evidence. Now again, that's important when you're talking to different people of different worldviews. There's some people who believe that we can't trust the physical world that we see. That it's not real. It's really just an illusion. And so anything that you were to bring to them, any arguments or reasonings based on the design of the universe, so clearly you can see the beautiful trees or the mountains, they would say, that doesn't matter to me. I don't trust the physical world. Now that's less common today. That's probably more common in Eastern religions. But that's why this one's a little bit different. This is kind of a hard one, and people have struggled with this one for a long time, but this was popularized by a man named Anselm of Canterbury. And basically what he was trying to say about this ontological argument is that he was trying to prove that it makes logical sense and only makes logical sense that God does exist. And the way he said this was that God should be defined as a maximally great being, okay? A maximally great being is the biggest, greatest, most powerful thing you can know. That was the idea behind this. And basically, then what he said was, whatever that we can conceive of that is the greatest, most powerful, biggest thing that you can imagine, there is God. And so we might define him a little bit differently between no matter who you are, but that thing that you can only imagine is the greatest and biggest and most powerful, that is God. And again, what he is a different question, right? And a lot of what we look at today in trying to prove the existence of God, we also have to remember that we can sit and discuss and debate the existence of God for a long time, but that doesn't answer the question sometimes of the God of the Bible. Again, you remember how many religions are there that exist that do believe in gods? I mean, that's what most religions are based around. And so it's one thing to prove that there is a God, a spiritual being that caused the universe and that is powerful and impressive and good. But it's another thing to eventually, after the fact, then get into why we believe he is the God that we read of in the Bible and that is true and the only God. So Anselm was saying that the biggest, greatest, most powerful being you can imagine, that is God. And so he has to exist because there is someone who is the biggest and greatest. Now that's confusing, okay? That's a weird, that'll make your brain hurt if you think about it long enough. And so a lot of people have had a problem with that. They say, well, that's not really strong enough. But he was trying to prove that basically God is necessary to the universe, right? God has to exist because there is someone or something that is the most powerful of all. So again, that is the ontological argument. It's really complicated, but that's one way that we can understand that God exists is he has to in this universe. Now, the second that makes a little bit more sense to us, and we'll spend longer on these next two, is the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument is defined as this. To prove that God exists, you would say, logically, whatever begins to exist has a cause. You can follow with me on this and make sure these make sense, right? Catch me, stop me if it doesn't logically make sense. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The second premise is the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe had a cause, right? That is two logical propositions that flow to a conclusion that has to logically make sense. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Does that make sense logically, right? If we were to, I probably should have put it up there so we could see that flow a little bit better, so I'm sorry about that. But the point is that this is supposed to prove logically that the universe was created by something. So we'll break it down a little bit at a time. This phrase, this proposition at the beginning, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now, anytime in some sort of big religious philosophical argument, you'll have people trying to break down little parts of it to make it not true, right? So if there's something you don't agree with someone on, typically there's a part of it that doesn't make sense. And if you can figure out that part, then you'll come to a better agreement. Well, here, if somebody were to try to break down this phrase, whatever begins to exist has a cause. I don't really know how you would even argue that, I'll be honest. I'm trying to be really fair here. But I don't know how you would argue that there are things out there that don't have a cause. Well, let me ask you, what exists that does not have a cause? Okay, yeah, God. Yes, that's true. Okay, so what in the universe exists? Whatever that we see empirically, what can we see that does not have a cause? Wait, nobody? Well, I think that's the point, right? The point is that there's no way this is not true because everything that we see and everything we've ever experienced and everything we ever know has been caused by something, right? There's no reason for us to believe anything else. When we look out into the world and see everything that we see and know everything about it that we know, there's nothing, not a single thing in the universe tells us that it doesn't have a cause. So that kind of answers that question. Well, what about this next one? That the universe began to exist. Now, I remember in college with my cousin, who's a really good thinker. He has some different worldviews than me, but he came up to me while I was in college, and I was, again, really interested in apologetics and understanding. I was in a class, actually, about this, and he came up to me and was wondering why. How do you know that the universe had a beginning? That's a really good question, right? How do we know that the universe had a beginning? Well, if we take away the fact that nothing else in the universe exists without a beginning, right? That's pretty good evidence. But there's a couple other things that we can use scientifically, empirically, to understand why we know that the universe had a beginning. And one of those is, now hopefully maybe there's some scientists in here that can give me a little bit of an explanation. There's a couple of people that I wish might have been here that could have explained this a little better. But from what I understand, the second law of thermodynamics tells us that basically, in simple terms, in my terms, in terms that I can understand, not my terms, that when energy exists, it only continues to deteriorate and to devolve into more chaos, essentially. And so the universe is not progressing toward more and more order. The universe is progressing more and more toward chaos and disarray, you could say. Okay, so if we take that principle, if that's something that we know because we have seen with our eyes and with microscopes and telescopes, and we know that to be true, that in the second law of thermodynamics, things progress toward disarray, then if the universe had no beginning, then how could the universe even be here at the moment? Because if it had an infinite, if it existed infinitely in time, then how could it not have been exploded by now? Does that make sense? Are you following me? So if the universe, this is why we argue for a young Earth, right? We don't believe that the Earth is millions or billions of years old. At least I don't, because I don't believe that with the rate that the universe is becoming more chaotic, not just socially, but also in terms of physical properties, that if it had an infinite past, it would have been exploded by now. It would have been completely disjointed in chaos and disarray. That's what the second law of thermodynamics tells us. And a good way to explore that and to understand like an actual scientific revelation that has led to that belief is Edwin Hubble, who created the Hubble telescope, determined through using a telescope that the universe is expanding at the moment. I don't know if you've heard that before, but that's kind of a wild thought. The universe is continuing to expand. And the reason why that's important is because the rate the universe is expanding in all of the ways that it is, then if it had an infinite past and never had a beginning point, then where we are now doesn't make sense. Because the world we live in today still has, I know it feels like absolute total chaos, but it still has design and it still has order, and it hasn't completely upended itself and combusted. Does that make sense? Is this blowing your mind, like kind of like the second law of thermodynamics, kind of like mine? And it's really confusing. And again, the reason that I put these on the screen is whichever one of these really interests you and really kind of go, oh, okay, I hadn't thought about that way before, or maybe you've already thought about it and you have a much better way of explaining it, go for it. Take that, run with it, study it, go look into it. We've got a girl in the youth group right now. I won't say her name because she'd be embarrassed, but she had a question in class, not about apologetics, but she had a question in class and she came and asked me, and before I could even come up with any response or anything, she had in the week prior studied and come up with like 4 pages of notes that she had handwritten all about this topic. I mean, she went into it. And that's the kind of desire that we have to know God. Right? Again, some of these make a little more sense to us than others, but we have to dig and search and understand who he is this way. Now, I want to explain this argument with a little bit of an analogy. I saw a really cool thing by an apologist, and I can't remember his name because the video was probably older than me, but he was a really good apologist. He said some really cool things, and he used a computer for this analogy, but I'll use what I know pretty well, or what I feel like I know pretty well. This is my Canon EOS R6, and this is something that over the course of college, I got to know pretty well. I know where I could take photos, videos with my eyes closed. I know every button on this. I know where every dial is. I know exactly how to take pictures because I've held it in my hand so much. And I love this thing. This is a really cool little piece of equipment that helps me to take photos or videos, really crisp and really cool. But what's important about this and what I think helps us to understand, again, you could do computer or whatever device helps you to understand this analogy, but did this cause itself? Did this just appear out of nowhere? Well, how do you know that? Okay, so we know nothing comes from nothing. There's not a single thing in the universe that didn't come from something else. Okay, how else do we know that this just didn't come from nowhere? It came from my office, but before then it didn't come from nowhere. What's that? Okay, it looks manufactured, right? The metal and the plastic and the pieces on this look like they probably didn't just happen to be there randomly. Okay, so it's purpose design. And we're going to get into specifically the design argument next. And we could use this for the same thing, right? We could look in, maybe I'll pull it back up and we'll look at it in a minute. But one of the hard things with, sometimes people will try to pin God into a box and say, because we can't understand him, how do you know that he exists? Because we don't know anything about spiritual beings or anything outside this world. All we know is empirical things. Where did God come from, right? You said when I asked who or what has not had a cause, and you said God. Well, sometimes people have a really hard time understanding that. But what I would argue is, for the person who made this Canon EOS R6, they gave it properties. Right? The properties of a computer or a camera or whatever it is, well, cameras these days, not a film camera, depending on what you're going with. But the creator of this camera gave it certain properties, right? It has to have a battery in it, which gives it electric current to be able to operate. And it's got a lens and a mirror and a sensor, and all these things help it to operate. And it has binary code, right? Again, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, I don't know these things super well, but I know, I've been told, it operates on binary code, which is ones and zeros that tell it somehow what to do. So the creator of this made this thing to do that. But does the person, the human who created it, operate by binary code? Or have a lens or a mirror or a sensor? Or does that person have to have a battery to run electric current through them to be able to operate on their day-to-day? The person who creates the thing is not bound to what they have created, is the point. Does that make sense? The person who creates the thing exists outside of it. So it's not fair for us to try to pin God into a box of our understanding of the physical properties that he created himself. Right? It's not fair for us to say, or logical or rational, for us to say, well, why can't I see God? Well, because he doesn't exist of the matter that he created. The same way that the person who created a camera doesn't use binary code the way that it does. And, we could apply that to any other aspect of God. The point I'm trying to make is God exists outside of what he has created. He made this world. And logically, again, as we know from looking at just about anything, he's not bound by time or space or matter or those things that he has created. He's above them. And that's what makes him God. So we have to understand and try to seek him without trying to pin him into those boxes. Can somebody read for me Psalm chapter 33, verses 6 through 9? Psalm 33, 6 through 9. We're asking the question, okay, if the universe had a cause, what caused it?
By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their hosts. He gathers the waters of the sea as a heap. He puts the deeps in storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke, and it came to be. He commanded it, and it stood firm.
We're asking the question, what caused this universe to exist? That's a perfectly fair, rational, reasonable question. And what the Bible says, through all the experience that these authors have all throughout their timeline, and we can pair that with ours, is that he spoke and it came to be. That's what Psalm 33, 9 says, very succinctly. Can somebody read for me John chapter 1 and verse 3? John 1 and 3. It's the same idea, just from the New Testament, and includes Jesus in this.
All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made.
What caused the universe? What caused everything that we see to be here? Well, all things were made through him, and without him, not a single possible thing was made. This is God. The answer to our question, what caused the universe, the cosmological argument is asking, what is the cause of this? And through reason and through Scripture, we know God caused this, right? We take the easy answer, go back to Genesis chapter 1, where he lays out exactly how he has caused this universe to be, and it's amazing. And I'm grateful that God has not only the love to create us to love him, but to give us the beauty of nature and the intelligence that we have to know him and to the heart that we have to relate to one another. This world is beautiful, but we'll get into that in this next argument, which is called the teleological argument. Now, this is another word that just basically defines the design argument. You've probably heard this before, and this is one of the most popular, and I would say this and the next argument are some of my favorite ways to understand and know that God exists. This is the teleological argument, or the design argument. So again, Mark, we could go back to this thing right here, right? Some great points were made that when we look at this thing, that is, when I asked what caused it to be, clearly, empirically, with our eyeballs, we look at this and go, that looks like someone put it together, right? This doesn't look like a heap of junk that just magically appeared to be here. And that's what we see with everything. When you walk outside and see a beautiful structure that is made with beautiful architecture, you look at it, okay, Sydney Opera House, the Empire State Building, whatever it is, you look at that and you go, somebody was behind that. A person, a human, probably, if we get that specific, a person or a human was there with the creativity and the intelligence and the design to know how to put those things together. This was popularized by a man named William Paley. And his argument, the way that he explained it, because he was probably living in a time before cameras, and definitely a camera as complex computer-wise as this one, was a watch. Now, the story goes that William Paley was walking along a beach, and as he was walking, where no one was around, no one was in sight, he's walking along a beach, and he just sees a watch laying on the sand. And he argues that when you pick that watch up, and there's no one around, and you don't even see a person who it may belong to, your natural instinct, based on every intuition that your mind is telling you, and every experience you've ever had in the world tells you that not only did it come from somewhere, that it was caused to be there. A watch doesn't just show up in the middle of nowhere for no reason, right? The answer, okay, what caused that is probably a human being dropped it. Or maybe a funny dog, I don't know. But not only that, but when you pick up a watch, you look at it and go, those are very small gears. And there's a battery or a winding mechanism in there. And the pieces fit together perfectly. And they operate with precision. And they have been cut in a way that is perfect. And you see that object and you say, somebody, like a building or like the camera or whatever it is, somebody was behind that, right? That's not irrational or illogical. That's normal. And that's everything that all of our brains are telling us. That when we see something of that level of design and intricacy, we know that it had to have been created or designed by someone or something. There's an interesting couple of aspects of the world, the universe, the earth that we live in, that if you really dig into it, you realize how perfectly created the world is. And again, I didn't dig into the perfect science of this because I don't know it fully. And to me, I trust that God did this, right? But you were to dig into what they call the fine-tuning of the universe, right? You've probably heard this before. If the world, I should say Earth, if the Earth was any closer to the sun, then what? We would explode, We would be too hot, we would burn up, and it would be uninhabitable for life to live here. Well, the opposite could be said. If the earth was too far away from the sun, what would happen? We would freeze, and it wouldn't be inhabitable for humans and life here on this place. And so you add to that the concepts of gravity and of light and of sunlight and the way that all of the intricacies of the universe work together, the photosynthesis of plants in biology to create the oxygen that supports the life of humans, and the rain that falls from the sky to have a life cycle in the oceans and the rivers. And all of these things are so precision crafted that I don't see a way, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I don't see a way that this got to be here without a designer. The phrase that you hear often with the teleological argument is, design demands a designer. And again, that is not controversial. It shouldn't be. And we don't want to operate with controversial premises or controversial phrases to just gimmick our point till we can just be louder than another person. Let's use logic and reasoning. And this is logic and reasoning. Design demands a designer. That's natural and normal. Somebody read for me Psalm 19, verses 1 and 2.
The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge.
The things of the universe, the heavens that we look out and explore, they are proclaiming the handiwork, the craftiness, the creativity of the God that we are proposing exists. It's declaring to us, same way that Romans 1, 19 and 20 says, that we are without excuse. I mean, think about how difficult you would have to be as a reasoner to look out and to see the design and to dismiss it just on the basis of, well, nuh-uh, right? I have never heard personally, again, I don't want to speak for others, but I've never heard a good argument that tells me why the design can exist in the world as it does without having a designer. So thank you for reading Psalm 19:1. The last argument is, again, sort of a thought argument, because it does involve empirical, and our relational experience. But this is the moral argument. And to me, this is one of the most powerful ways that we can know not only that God exists, but just on a more basic level, that we can know it's not just us, if that makes sense. It's a little nuanced, and it takes a lot of discussion with people and trying to work through it, and you'll have to understand this in your own mind before we can continue to have these conversations with other people. But the premise of the moral argument is simply that without a moral lawgiver, there is no standard for morality or ethics for the way that we live our lives. I mean, are you glad for a standard of ethics that we live with, right? Those occur in smaller settings. We have standard of ethics maybe within this congregation. We have a standard of morals or ethics that's bound within the code of law that we live in here in Fort Mill, South Carolina, North Carolina, or the USA. There are standards built within that. And we're glad for that, right? Because guess what that means? I can't walk up to Matt Ibbotson and beat him up and get away with it. I'm not allowed to do that. That's not right. And somehow, in our own human intuition and the experience that we live with in this world, we agree on that, right? And the hard part is sometimes we agree with with the ethics and the morals that benefit us, and sometimes as humans we agree and are okay with the moral, or we're not okay with the ones that don't benefit us, and that's the hard part. But either way, as C.S. Lewis argues in Mere Christianity and some other places really well, there is a natural law of being a human that is impossible to throw that ethical and moral compass off. Right? We call that our conscience. Again, we all know that to murder is just wrong. Now, there are ways that people try to justify it, but again, everybody, if you ask them if it would be right or just or or allowed for you to murder them, they would say, no, please don't do that. I don't like that idea. And so I'll say it the way that Dostoevsky said in The Brothers Karamazov. If there is no God, then everything is permitted. Right? Again, I've not heard a good argument where someone honestly argued from a secular, non-religious, non-God-fearing standpoint that everyone should agree on their standard of ethics. Right? And that's why we believe that we have a standard of ethics that comes from scriptures, and that God himself, who we believe to be the moral lawgiver within us, has also imparted to us in the words, thankfully here, that we have a standard to live by. And we have a code that we follow. Now, can somebody read for me our last verse tonight, Jeremiah 12:1.
Righteous are you, O Lord, and I am kind to you, yet I will plead my case before you. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all who are treacherous thrive?
Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Well, the way of the wicked prospers because in a lawless world, crime pays. Right? If you live in a world without standards or morality or ethics, crime pays. You could get away with whatever you want, and you are self-seeking and you're having a great time. As far as you're concerned, you rob a bank and nobody has a problem with it. Go for it. That helps you out, I guess. Now, in the end, that's not a way for a society to live, and we know that. But the wicked prosper in a lawless world. But that's why God has created us, built within us, that standard of ethics and morals that tugs on us at all times. We can't escape it. It doesn't matter what society you live in or what society you come from. There are isolated sections of people all across the world, and there are things that we agree on just by nature of being made in the image of God. There's things that we cling to, the sanctity of life being one of the major ones. And how can we all agree on that without it coming from somewhere? Morality may differ between people, but everybody has some agreement on certain things. And again, this is nuanced and takes some building up of your own understanding of this moral argument, but it's a good way for us to understand, like I said, at its very basic premise, we're not the only ones here. What we have within us came from somewhere. That moral code that we have comes from a moral lawgiver. As we conclude, I just want to say a couple things here. As we put together and we try to understand God's existence and how can we know and understand him, I'll say this. The existence and nature of a triune, infinite, good creator God sometimes and in some ways may be inexplainable. Some of his characteristics are difficult to understand. But I would argue, even with our best evidence, it is never irrational to believe in the God that we serve. Again, there's questions that will be unanswered because, again, he operates outside of what he has created. There's aspects of him we'll never understand or never know because we don't possess them. But it's never irrational for us to follow and know and understand that this God exists. Arguments for God's existence don't immediately lead anyone to believe in the God of the Bible. Like I said at the beginning, that's another step. So we take these arguments and we work them in naturally and in conversation, in building a relationship with people to help them not only understand who God is, but then we move on to explaining through the beauty of Scripture who that God is, right? We know that he exists through these things. These four arguments is one of the ways. We know that he exists. But this is how we learn who he is. And that's the next step that we move on from there. And that's some of the stuff that we're going to get to in the next couple of weeks. So I'm glad you're here tonight. I'm thankful that you've been a part of this. Thank you for having me as your guest speaker tonight. And we'll get into our worship period in just a minute.